The Sports Source is brought to you by Fast Frame. Turn your memorabilia into a work of art.
This is The Sports Source, presented by Bill Hotz and Associates, and by Renewal by Andersen, with your host, John Pennington.
Into the Bill Hotz and Associates today. We are going to be covering Tennessee's second scrimmage, their last big scrimmage before season opener against West Virginia. We have a lot of stuff to cover today. We have a lot of guests that are going to be rotating through on the show, so let's get into this thing. First segment of our program, obviously brought to you by Bill Hotz and Associates. There is a reason people tell lawyer jokes. Most folks don't like lawyers until they need a good one. Then it's no joke. Just like it's no joke if you're injured in a car accident. Remember the name Bill Hotz and Associates, folks. Trust them, call them when you need them. Bill Hotz and Associates. Here's some gentlemen I trust and call, or at least I tell them that. Bob Hodge is right here, Josh Ward, Ryan Callahan, Chuck Cavaleris down there. We still have Mike Strange, who will join us in a few minutes. So big show today. Jeremy Pruitt still hasn't named a quarterback, despite a lot of people looking at the quarterbacks in the 5 minutes everybody gets to look at them and saying, Guarantano's really got the better arm. Still, Pruitt's not saying that he's not giving any suggestion that he's making a move in one direction or another. Let's take a look at some of his quotes from yesterday's scrimmage just to prove that. Playing as many quarterbacks as we played today was probably not fair to the offense. It's hard for a quarterback that goes out there and plays 8 snaps to get in a good rhythm. It's not like changing up a series in a game. You play, the other team has the ball, then you're back out there. But we gave all 4 quarterbacks an opportunity today because we feel like they deserve it. So it probably hindered the offense's timing and stuff there. And then he also said every day when you watch practice, all 4 guys do some really good things. Again, it's about being consistent, not making the critical errors. If you were driving 7 or 8 plays in, it only takes 1 play to mess things up. We've got to stay out of the negative plays, and our guys are reducing those every day. I think eventually, when the first guy or the second guy or the third guy kind of shows himself, we'll whittle it down. Until then, we'll just kind of stay status quo until we figure it out. Folks, there are 10 practices before West Virginia. Thoughts on the quarterback situation, Ryan?
One thing, I think we're reading into his comments something that he's not really saying yet, which is that he's dividing the reps equally between the 4 quarterbacks. I think he is giving all 4 of them reps. When you have 131 snaps, that's going to happen. But I don't think all 4 guys are being given the same number of reps with the first and second teams and things like that. I still think it's Keller Chris, it's Jarrett Guarantano battling for the starting job going into the season opener. I do think it's interesting he keeps mentioning JT Shroud and his arm strength and some of the good things he's showing. Maybe later in the year, if he's a guy that continues to progress, he ends up being a factor. But I still think it's a 2-man race. I still would be surprised if Jarrett Guarantano is not the starter. I just don't think Jeremy Pruitt wants to say a whole lot about that competition.
Chuck, your thoughts on the quarterbacks and what Pruitt says there. Let's assume that he is giving some guys. At what point do you stop giving snaps, though, to the 3rd and 4th guys?
Today. I mean, I really think it's time to whittle it down. Now, you got to have a pretty good idea who your top 2 are going to be. And it's really going to be important to see how the reps go with those. Who's the quarterback going to be in the second quarter? Because you're going to be out there and really messing up. And look at what advantage West Virginia has at this position. You really could get outplayed badly. You need to get somebody ready and at least get this offense where they can move the ball and keep the defense off the field some.
Okay. He also had a comment, as he did after the last scrimmage, about inconsistency. It seems to be something. Now, coaches talk inconsistency, but here's what Jeremy Pruitt had to say about that. And I'm glad we put the biggest monitor the farthest away from me on set, because with my bad eyes, I'm having to walk everywhere. We had some guys that I thought competed much better today on both sides of the ball. The one thing that sticks out to me when you watch is we can go 8 or 9 guys can do it the right way on every single play. The problem is we have 1 or 2 that don't do it right, and if you don't have everybody doing it right, sometimes you ain't going to have success. And it's different guys every time. It's talking about being consistent, being a master at your position, blah, blah, blah. Thoughts on the inconsistency, Josh Ward?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you're going to go to every camp around the country and you're going to hear about consistency and inconsistency. I think that's maybe the most consistent part of the month of August in college football. You also hear coaches say 8 or 9 guys do it right, 1 or 2 don't. But I also think it very much applies to Tennessee right now, and I think it's a reflection when Jeremy Pruitt mentions both sides of the football. On offense, you have a lot of young players. You have guys that are unproven. You're trying to put an offensive line together. For most of practice, you don't have your best offensive lineman out there. And the quarterback battle that we just talked about. And then on the defensive side, there's a lot to learn. Guys that put on weight, are they still going to go make tackles? I think that's a question as well. I think the point is big picture. There's a lot of developing still to do in Tennessee's football program, and he uses the 8 or 9 doing it right, 1 or 2 not, as kind of a reflection of all that they still have to do.
Okay, very good. And the last thing that we're talking about here in this first segment, we got a lot more in today's show, but the last thing we're talking about in the first segment, we mentioned this early on, that you're going to have a head coach who's doing it for the first time, trying to figure out, okay, the 2-point conversion, do we go for it on 4th down, those kind of calls, things he hasn't been thinking about previously in his job. You've got a first-time offensive coordinator in terms of calling plays. And on the defensive side of the ball, you had very limited play calling experience there, too. That may not be the worry that anybody thought about. Let's take a look at what he said. Let's go to the graphic. Pruitt on defensive play calls. Well, with Kevin Shearer, Charles Kelly, Tracy Rocker, Chris Rumpf, all those guys I've worked with before. Really, any of those guys could call our defense. All of them could. During the season, we'll put the game plan together as a group, and I'm not leaving Terry Fair out. Terry's just hasn't been with us before. He's learning and is doing a really good job at it. When we get into the season, I will probably call the defensive calls. Bob Hodge, your thoughts on Jeremy Pruitt being the guy who calls defense?
I think it is an outstanding idea, because what you're going to end up with is this is his defense. He's going to have input from guys that have worked with him before, but in the end, he's the one that fine-tunes everything. And not to be a homer for another team, but in Minnesota, Mike Zimmer went up there, defensive guru, and he's 5 years into his job. He still makes the defensive calls for the Vikings. I think it's a good idea to let the guy who's actually building the defense, even though the rest of them are familiar, go ahead and make the calls. And I do think that alleviates one of the worries. Okay, what are you going to do? First-time guys up there in their booth making calls? Nope, not for Jeremy Pruitt. He's done it for years.
Does that, though, create a concern with the fact that you're going to be worrying about making defensive calls, and all of a sudden something happens in the game and, oh, I got to put the head coach's hat on and decide what we're doing here? Kirby Smart did it at Georgia, but he had a rougher first year than anybody expected, but not a concern.
Right. Now, I just think that, yeah, he's going to be in tune with what the defense is doing most, but in the end, I think, you know, those things are going to have to work themselves out with the first-year head coach, regardless of who's making defensive calls or not.
I agree. I think personally, while it could make it more difficult in terms of the adjustment as a head coach, something he hasn't done before, making those calls, like I said, Kirby Smart, he was expected to win 9-10 games his first year. They won 7 in the regular season. They got an 8th one in the bowl game. Did not live up to expectations because he's taking the defensive coordinator role, the head coach role, all that stuff together. But, you know,
I think
Butch Jones was big on mottos. My motto, if I were setting the motto for this team, first year, rip the Band-Aid. Rip the Band-Aid off, go with youth, go ahead and get your coaching situation and your calls the way you want. If it's a little rough around the edges in year 1, make that the year that it's rough around the edges. So rip the Band-Aid, I'm good with it.
The concern I would have would be if things aren't going as well as you hope, and then you start having some problems, what happens when the defense comes off the field? Isn't his inclination to go right over there with them and say, here's what we got to do, kind of rally the troops? Well, he needs to also be concerned about the offense, doesn't he?
Well, and I think that's something that works itself out over time. And I agree with John 100%. You've got a year, probably your only year, that this is kind of a gimme. You know, people are going to cut you some slack. So figure out what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and do it this year. I mean, what? You know, okay, gee whiz, instead of winning 6 games, they won 5. I mean, you know.
You're so negative. It's 8 and a minimum. I've been reading the message boards, man. All right. More from the scrimmage a little, well, coming up next, not a little later, just very soon. We'll be talking next about Darren Kirkland Jr., Juwan Jennings, the O-line, and more. Come on back on the Sports Source.